MLB just released the findings of a year-long study on pitching injuries. In this video, we're going to dig into what exactly they found, whether there is any hope for the sport in keeping pitchers healthy, but more important to me is looking at some independent voices in this space, the baseball community, and what they had to say. Because I think there are some really good thoughts out there on this that maybe weren't perfectly articulated by this very long study that the league put together. Jesse Rogers had the tweet that broke this, and there was a follow-up by Jeff Passan. This is probably what we'd call like the facts part of this, right? What did the league report and what's relevant in there? Maybe I could critique it a little bit based off what I'm going to get to later in terms of the nuance. But we'll start with this Jesse Rogers tweet and the study. 62 pages, year long, etc. 200 plus people, a lot of different kinds of people, as you see right here. Broad recommendations. Again, there's nothing particularly groundbreaking about this. For the most part, it's really just rehashing this concern that everyone has around a lot of pitchers at any level of baseball getting hurt and impacting the game long term. So let's talk this chart off the top, which I find interesting. The first problem here, the y-axis is not the same. So a little bit of a concern here, right? This looks like a massive jump. Looks like a larger jump than anything in here, but it's not, perhaps, compared to this year two graph here. Not year two, but spring training through opening day. What they're talking about is IL placements, right? That's like right in spring training, right in this window where you're ramping back up. What we see is a pretty steady increase to 2024. Okay, it's jumped 30 or so, which is, what is that? A little under 50%. That's a big jump between 2022 and 2024. The more interesting graph, I think, is here, though. And I think a lot of the time, in this piece at least, not Jesse in particular, but just MLB study pointed out the fact that everyone's getting hurt more often. But I do think the biggest part of this graph that matters the most to me is right here between 2019 and 2021, where you see 150, basically a 50% increase in IL placements from day 2 of the season through the end of the championship year. So it's a much longer period of time, but on a percent basis, this is a massive jump. And in between that is 2020, the year where everyone's chronic workload, so to speak, dropped a lot. That is, I think, a very important part of this whole thing, is this concept. You have a lot of old school people thinking that you shouldn't throw a ton in the offseason. I actually had someone from a major media outlet, when I first met them, look me dead in the eye and say, the league should mandate basically 2 months off where no pitchers could throw a baseball. And I think that encapsulates a lot of what the public believes, which is that you need rest. And I've even talked to some pitchers who, retired pitchers who believe this as well. But it butts heads almost directly with what I've heard from a lot of people in baseball, currently working in baseball, which is the only way to combat injuries is to make sure that your workload in the offseason is high enough such that you can adapt when you then get into higher intensities in game. That's at the crux of all this. So you're going to have to convince all these people that have a lot of stock in the game, have been healthy for a very long time, who have more experiential thoughts that resting is important. And perhaps it is, but again, it's probably more on the workload side as we're going to get into. But that to me is the most, I don't want to say damning thing, but it's the largest signal we have in here, is that you have this year where no one threw as much, and then in the subsequent year, you have a massive increase. And then since then, right, it's gone down. It's almost gone down to pre-2020 levels for the most part. It's right around there. I'd be fascinated to see if we see another subtle drop this year. But that is the biggest thing. This downtrend right here is super important from 2021 through 2024, pointing out the fact that pitchers have been able to increase their chronic workload again, how much they're throwing over long periods of time, such that they're able to take on the stress of these individual outings, the acute workload that gets high. And you see it again here, like this is something that's been pointed out by numerous people, not just me. The fact that these injuries kind of peak at periods of time where ramp-ups occur. You see a hump right here in March and April, etc., then it tails off and goes down throughout the season. And then you're wondering maybe why there's an August bump, right? There's a shutdown. In July, there's a period of time where the All-Star break happens and guys perhaps aren't throwing, and then you see a bit of a latent effect, and those injuries having an effect on, or not injuries, but that downtime having an effect on guys. Again, getting back to this workload point. So, again, there's not a ton in here that I find particularly crazy. Most of it is just logical, like velocity is a big driver, obviously, injury placements, etc. Other contributing factors we can look at right here: modern workload strategies, protect pitchers, reduce workloads, may be contributing to injuries. That's the point I'm getting at, which I'm glad that it was included, is just that, reducing workloads to prevent injury is not actually helping. You build fitness through accumulating stress, and we just kind of maybe totally haven't seen that. Cardiovascular de-emphasis and endurance training for pitchers in favor of power and strength focused training. That's interesting. I haven't talked to anyone on the S&C side about this specifically. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, if the league is incentivizing people to throw hard, then I could totally see in shorter spurts, and I could totally see why power strength focused training is more important overall. Prior history, rule changes, etc. COVID, yeah. Again, that's the jump I'm talking about here. That they is in this graph up here that I think is the most relevant graph in this entire piece, hitting on the workload point. But yeah, I mean, surgical advantages, internal brace. Now, a lot of other things in the study. I'll link to it in the description to check out. It's interesting. Again, no surprise here. Jeff Passan had really good thoughts. His 5 major takeaways. He had a tweet about it, and we'll take a look at his major takeaways. Early season injuries have become especially worrisome to teams. That gets back again to our workload point. The next phase of this is fascinating. A detailed examination of off-season training regimens and early season workloads. I'm going to be fascinated if the conclusion there eventually, whenever we get part 2 of this study that comes out, is that guys should be throwing more in the offseason and throwing breaking balls in the offseason. I know of at least one major league organization that is writing programs for pitchers in the offseason that has them not throwing breaking balls for multiple months. And I will not be shocked at all if that organization has injury problems. But I think it'd be pretty crazy if the league comes out and says you should be monitoring more aggressively workloads and you should be throwing more. But I don't necessarily know if they're going to get that specific. That would seem like a very overarching point. But again, to people on the SNC side and a lot of sharp people in the game, that is probably one of the main ways to mitigate some of the injury problems. But yeah, let's see what else Passan has. Yeah, most significant are velocity, spin chasing, and max effort pitching. Okay, I would say for the most part, the velo and spin chasing are connected. Unless spin chasing is specifically related to like sweepers and stuff. I know Keith Meister has had some thoughts about whether this modern sweeper is causing issues in the arm because of how hard these guys are leaning into supination and throwing that pitch. You know, we probably at any point in baseball history haven't had guys throwing 87-mile-per-hour sweepers going 12 inches horizontally. I just don't think that ever existed. And we've also seen a lot of those guys pop. Kyle Bradish, Shohei Ohtani, etc. I'm sure the list goes on and on. Those are the 2 that hop to mind. I think it's Bradish too, not Bradish. I don't know why I said it like that. But everything starts with velocity, pass, and no surprise on the nose. Great book, The Arm. Everyone should read it if you like baseball. Technology runs the game. It just gets back into performance incentives, right? If we have all this tech showing people that it is good to throw hard, then why would you not throw hard? Why would you be worse at your job when everything is telling you that this is more important? And of course, command, changing speeds, all these things really matter. But again, the baseline of velo creates some buffer that is incredibly important. The minor leagues don't prepare pitchers. We'll get into a tweet from Kyle Boddy about this that I really like. But yeah, I think we're definitely babying minor leaguers too much for the most part. Again, the through line you're seeing that I'm pointing out here is the workloads in the offseason throughout the season, I think, are artificially low, as there is really not much incentive to be a starting pitcher. Amateur trickle down, yeah, that gets into some stuff I'm not going to totally hit on, but Passan seems to think that's one of the biggest things here that he tweeted about too, is just amateur athletes are going to emulate what they see succeeding at the major league level. So if we're seeing velocity succeed at the major league level, then they have all the incentive in the world to push velo at a really young age, which is totally fair. And I don't really know how to combat that. No surprise here. Kyle, co-founder of Driveline, super sharp dude, works for the Red Sox now. He's always on the nose, I think, with a lot of this stuff. And this is in relation to Passan's point in terms of babying minor league pitchers far too much to the point of workload underexposure. Here's a really good quote. If Hunter is limited all year, then what exactly is he going to do in the show in 2022? He threw 80 innings in sim games last year, plus alt-site, and he sits at 100 miles per hour in the 6th inning. Cutting him to 65 pitches does what exactly? Great point. Yeah, that's encapsulating what we're talking about here on the workload side of things that I think is really important. I also want to bring up, I really like this. I didn't necessarily know who Chris Martin was before, perhaps because I'm not locked on college baseball. I got locked on college baseball from the draft perspective for MLB Network this most recent season, and I'm already looking at like Jamie Arnold, some of these guys from FSU, etc., Tyler Brenmer and stuff. Fun. I'm excited for the draft. As you can see, I'm already talking about it, and it's December of 2024. But I didn't know who Chris Martin was, partially because I'm just not totally locked on like the coaching side of college baseball. But yeah, he had some good points here that I wanted to show. Velocity is the key driver of performance for the vast majority of pitchers. Without it, stuff plays down. Hitters are too good. Umpire strike zones are too accurate these days to simply locate and get outs. It's increasingly apparent that good stuff in the zone is the way to compete. There are obviously other important skills as a pitcher. Ability to manage workload, adequate preparation for the season before spring training, and physical development are ways to mitigate injury risk. Unless the game were to shift away from incentivizing velocity, higher injury risk will remain. Everything in the performance world is a cost-benefit analysis. The benefit of not getting innings in college or not making the big leagues As a professional is zero, cost goes up when chasing velocity, but the benefit goes up exponentially more. What he's talking about here is like, if you're accepting more risk on the front end, but your marginal gain is huge, then it's totally fair to accept that risk. And I think risk tolerance, risk aversion, and thinking about risk is something that I don't, and this is probably me too, I'm definitely learning, but most of the public probably doesn't do that well. And as a result of that, I imagine potentially a lot of decision makers in baseball don't maybe necessarily understand risk balance well. But I guess that's just the nature of the beast, you know? You have baseball's such a weird industry where you have teams that are just accumulating value, and it doesn't really matter if you're run poorly for the most part. You're still going to accumulate value as an org. You think of like any other business, if you're a poorly run organization, what are the chances you actually appreciate, 2, 3, 4-fold over a course of a 10-year period of time, or from your purchase price, so to speak? Baseball's like that. It almost doesn't matter what you do. And I wonder whether that's connected back to the risk side of just, doesn't really matter. Let's not really try too much and let's make random decisions, not really think objectively on a variety of things. And we'll still be able to sell this team for $2 billion, even though I bought it for $400 million, etc. But anyways, that's besides the point. We're talking pitcher injuries here, but he had some great points here. And Kyle responded to, any answer that is pitchers should simply be worse at their jobs is absurd. Unfortunately, that's the majority of opinions after the study was read. And then Martin followed up with a great point here. Average fastball velo of the last 6 Cy Young winners is 96 miles per hour. Chasing the opposite is sure intriguing. It's a great point. And again, I think there were some points here, like this guy brought up changing speeds, etc. I agree with Martin again. It seems like our thoughts align a ton. This gets into like the tactical point of pitching, which if you do not have some baseline of velocity in the modern game, it won't matter that you understand how to change speeds and do all these other things if you're sitting 86. Like think of how many pitchers in Major League Baseball right now can sit 86 or sit low 90s alone. And those guys are old because they've been in the league, since the early 2000s, perhaps let's say early 2010s or something, to the point where they were able to almost prove that they had command in this larger sample, and now teams are more tolerant to them. But on the minor league side, if you're sitting 88 without some crazy outlier release trade or something, then it's very hard, I think, to get around the concept that you don't need velocity. And I mean, everyone that I think is sharper in this space is pointing this out. One thing I did want to point out, I believe there was a shot taken at weighted balls. Yeah, weighted ball training was also identified as needing more study, as there are mixed opinions and contributions to injuries. Now, I do believe there was a peer-reviewed study that Kyle posted, Boddy, a while back about this that found, the performance results are insane. It's crazy that baseball hadn't been using like implements of some kind for a long time when most other Olympic throwing sports do. Perhaps were they different throwing sports, etc. You're not getting into crazy degrees of max external rotation. You're not throwing down a slope for the most part as baseball. But so I'm a bit skeptical on how this is worded, identified as needing more study, mixed opinions on its contribution to injuries. I'd almost like a contribution to injuries despite the fact that it's allowing pitchers to potentially stay healthier for the most part. How many guys are throwing plyos now in major league rotations, etc.? How many young guys are as well and taking care of their arm, etc.? But this point from Michael O'Connell, who used to work for Driveline Baseball, makes a lot of sense. Programming is complex. Just say that instead of the whole tool being bad. The point he's getting at here is that the tool is not bad. How it's phrased here is almost pointing out as if it is bad. But the workload management, tracking, etc., and how guys are ramped, that is the largest point for injury. I think this is probably where some teams are going to get an edge, and I don't imagine all organizations are going to have that edge. I worry almost that in a couple years, there's certain organizations that are keeping their pitchers substantially healthier, than other teams. As other teams realize how important velocity is, they maybe push their pitchers, etc. And they just do not have the programming understanding in the offseason or how to ramp guys or how to use weighted balls properly, and just think the implement is bad, the weighted ball is bad, when that's not necessarily the case. So what does he say in the abstract here? This is in relation to this. Ball weight significantly affected pitch velocity, max elbow flexion, maximum pelvis rotation, blah, blah, blah. None of the measured arm joint kinetics were significantly affected by the ball weight. So this is like a peer-reviewed study by a lot of sharp people here that, I don't know, it seems like the league might just be completely looking over. Maybe they haven't completely looked over. I won't say that, but I don't necessarily know. But that's a great, I can't imagine anyone in baseball is using as objective info as O'Connell, Lindley, like all these guys are, I believe, in major league organizations, a majority of them. Lindley's, I think, with the Phillies, Brady's with the Phillies, Caravan, I don't believe, is with Driveline anymore. Driveline did a study on this, and I get I'm a Driveline guy at the heart, but I do think it's relevant to some extent. And then my guy here, Brian Bannister, I love this guy. He had some really good thoughts. To sum this all up, as we put a cap on things in terms of just what exactly has to happen. He basically says, like, the athlete's job is to get better, and the coach's job is to help them. You know, athlete's job is to push their ceiling, coach's job is to help them on a path to do that. The league, he points out, is to create barriers and create rules to prevent these issues from happening, which puts the onus back on the league. And I think I've talked about this before. There's a variety of ways they can do this. I think they could do it through double hook, tying the DH back to the starting pitcher. You lose the DH if you pull your starting pitcher before 18 outs or something along those lines. He talks about in this spiel here that he likes the concept of 5 outs for a reliever, 4 outs for a reliever. You basically have to create a barrier or incentive that forces guys to throw more pitches. And I think that's how you get a plateau velocity and potentially a downtick a bit of pitching injuries, is just forcing guys to throw more in season, which will then force them to prep more in the offseason and increase that workload standpoint, which is really important. Again, I'm not a programming expert. I imagine there's a lot of nuance to that topic, but everybody I talk to in the league that is working with pitchers and has been able to keep pitchers healthy, I believe, is on this train. And Bannister, I think, is one of the sharpest voices in the space, and he's right on it. You know, he knows that ramp up is huge. And you look at 2 cases last year, Garrett Crochet and Paul Skenes, both guys who capped out workload probably pretty early and then ended up throwing through the end of the season in shorter stints because it just didn't make sense to shut them down and risk how long that off time would have been or lower intensity, etc. would have been. But getting their CNS up for those outings throughout the course of the season maybe will become the standard, and maybe that's one way to mitigate injuries. But I do think looking at both those guys will be fascinating. That might give some signal to the league as a whole and maybe convince some of these old school people that totally shutting them down is not the way to do it. You know, I believe the Marlins did this with a pitcher last year. Was it Yuri Perez or Max Meyer? Didn't they send Max Meyer to the minors to do like lower stress innings? I imagine that maybe wasn't the most sound process given the fact that majority of their staff now is gone on the pitching side. But anyways, pitching injuries is an incredibly complex topic. It's cool to see this advancement, even if, or at least this study published, even if there wasn't a groundbreaking thought. But I just wanted to bring up some of the tweets that I saw around it that I thought were pretty important. So hope you enjoyed this video. I'll probably be doing more on pitcher injuries because it's just such a hot button issue. Until then, enjoy the holidays. Take care.